Hello, everyone. In my life, I've done quite a lot of things, actually. I've been in Taekwondo, I've played tennis, I've played the violin, I've actually done some dance, done theater, I was in gymnastics, I was even on a jump rope performance team when I was in elementary school. Now, did I become a professional at all of those things? No, I didn't. However, all of those things I do think contributed to the person that I am today. And what does that have to do with writing? Well, it has a lot to do with writing in the fact that oftentimes students think that everything that they do, everything that they do when it comes to writing, when it comes to research, when it comes to reading, when it comes to note taking and outlining, all of it has to be efficiently designed for the final product. And well, just like kind of like my life and where I've done a bunch of different things in which I never really became a professional at, writing is messy. Writing is growth. Writing is something that you cannot just do right away, at least not well. There's a process to writing. And in this video, I would like to actually talk about the process of writing. I'll actually explain what the writing process is and how it can benefit you in helping you to achieve your goals when it comes to any kind of writing situation. Before I begin, I would like to note that although I'm going to go through various stages of the writing process, going through basically what ideally should be the beginning and then what you should do at the end of the writing process, that does not necessarily mean you have to do those things in exactly this order that I'm going to present. As I mentioned earlier, writing is a messy process. If you're doing it well, it is going to look chaotic. It is going to look messy. And it's okay for it to look messy, especially in the very beginning stages, because thinking is messy. Clarifying our thought processes is messy. And so it's okay to kind of be fine with the mess. And so although I'm going to present these in various stages in terms of ideally how those stages should progress, you can skip, you can jump around. Of course, you should probably do proofreading and editing later in the writing process, but even in that instance, it's okay if you spend maybe like a couple of minutes or so proofreading or editing a paragraph that you've written, for instance, even if that paragraph never actually makes it into the final essay. Those steps or those skills or the things that you're practicing on can be beneficial, can help you clarify. As you're working through that paragraph, for instance, as you're editing it, you may realize this is not the direction that I want to go in, so I'm going to go in a completely different direction. That is a good step, even if you actually never use the paragraph that you've written. So although I'm going to be presenting these steps in a specific kind of order, that does not mean you have to follow that order. You can jump around, you can work on pre-writing, you can write a couple of sentences, you can write some analysis, and then you can work on some proofreading, editing, and revision. All of these things can happen at various stages. So you don't have to go from the beginning to the end. Although I would suggest doing the pre-writing stuff a little bit in the earlier stages of the process and maybe saving some of the proofreading and editing stuff for the later stages. Mostly for the pre-writing stuff, you want to build a foundation to make the writing process a little bit easier. The more work that you do in the pre-writing stages, the less likely you're going to experience something like writer's block. And as far as proofreading and editing, a lot of students get so worked up in making their sentences perfect that they don't end up actually putting words to the page. And so the proofreading and editing stages are something that's best left usually for the end. In the beginning stages and the drafting stages and all of the early stages, don't worry about your writing being perfect. It's not meant to be perfect at that stage. It becomes polished, it becomes better in the later stages. So in the earlier stages, forget about proofreading and editing, forget about making those perfect sentences or using the best words or where commas should go. Forget about it. Save that for the end. And so in order to save yourself some stress and some time, I do suggest making or saving proofreading and editing for the later stages of the writing process. But again, those are just some suggestions. You can do this however you want, as long as you end up with the product that you are happy with and helps you to achieve your goals. It's fantastic. Okay, as for the writing process itself, there are multiple stages. There's pre-writing, outlining, drafting, revising, editing, and proofreading. Let's start with pre-writing. Pre-writing is basically the stage where it's going to be the messiest. This is where you're going to select your topic, you're going to start narrowing your topic, you're going to start doing some research, you're going to do some note taking, you're going to be jotting some ideas down. You're basically going to be throwing everything at the wall, so to speak. This is the stage where you really shouldn't edit yourself. You really shouldn't cut out ideas. This is when you should throw everything you can possibly can, even if it sounds silly, even if it sounds preposterous, just get the ideas onto the page or onto your computer screen or just somewhere. Get it out there. Then later in the process, you can kind of start narrowing it down. But in the early stages of the writing process, you really shouldn't be limiting yourself in terms of ideas, even if many of those ideas are not going to be used for the final product. In my classes, I do find that a lot of students are usually looking for the bare minimum in terms of what they are going to do in this early stage of the writing process. They want to find the statistic that's going to help prove their point. They're going to find that one quote that's going to help support their argument. And that is fine, especially if you're on a time crunch. Once you find the evidence that you need, go ahead and move on. Move on to the next piece of evidence, move on to the next research, move on to the next stage. That's fine. But I want to encourage students to, at least in the pre-writing stages of the writing process, to have an open mind. Look for contradictory evidence. Look for a kind of landscape of how people are talking about, how they are arguing about, debating this particular topic that you have selected. Look at what the general landscape is. When it comes to most writing, I shouldn't say most writing, all writing, you are entering into a conversation that has been ongoing by thousands to millions of people. And what you want to do is you want to do what's called an intervention. You want to intervene your own ideas into the mix, and you want to contribute something new to the topic, to that discussion. Just like it would be annoying if someone entered into a conversation and they just repeated what other people had already talked about, it's going to be annoying on the writing side too. And so although the information might be new to you, it's not new to the wider conversation that people are having about that particular topic. So it is useful for you to think about how you're going to intervene. What are you going to add to this conversation that other people haven't already added? And the pre-writing stage is where you're going to figure out what that baseline is, so then you can add your own piece to that conversation. So yes, in the pre-writing stages, as I said before, it is going to be messy. You're going to have a ton of material. If you're doing it right, you're going to have a ton of material that is not going to be used. No, it's never going to see the light of day when it comes to the final product. But that is okay. Just like all of those hobbies and skills and sports that I participated in when I was a kid, I never became a professional at them. I never monetized them. That doesn't mean they weren't useful. Didn't mean that they were useless or they were a waste of time. I still enjoyed them. I still love playing tennis. I still love theater. In fact, I use a lot of theater in my teaching and also in, of course, video production. Like what I'm doing currently, I use theater and what I learned from theater in this particular situation. And so all of that pre-writing stuff, even though a lot of it is probably never going to see the light of day, it is still a useful part of the writing process. So it's not something that you should try to skip or to try and jump ahead into other stages. This lays the foundation for the rest of your essay. And so when you are pre-writing, you should definitely select your topic. Start narrowing your topic down to what you hope to accomplish. You should start doing research. You should annotate that research, so make notes on it. If it's a web page, copy and paste it into a Word document or into a Google Doc and make notes about it. How are you going to respond to it? How do you think you might use that information? You may even write a note and say, I don't know if I'm going to use this, just in case. Pre-writing is also where you are generating ideas, but you're also starting to organize those ideas. You should kind of lump them in together to, group them together as part of larger ideas. So kind of have sub-ideas and kind of group them together into a kind of big umbrella idea. And at this stage, you should also be starting to craft your own main idea. You should start having what's called a working thesis. So a thesis is the main idea of the essay. It's the purpose of the essay. It's the reason why this essay exists. If it's an argumentative essay, then that essay should have an argument as its focus. What do you hope to prove or to accomplish by the end of the essay? Now, the working thesis is just as the name implies, a working thesis. It's not meant to be the final thesis. It's just meant to be kind of a picture of what you hope to accomplish. The working thesis is meant to change. As you start working on the rest of your essay, you may realize that the argument maybe is not working the direction that you thought it was going to go, and so you should change your thesis. But at the pre-writing stage, near the end of the pre-writing stage, before you get into the outlining stage, you should be generating a working thesis, or a kind of an idea, a big picture idea of what you hope to accomplish in the essay. Now let's move on to outlining. Outlining is where you are working out a plan of what you think the essay is going to look like. This is the structure. This is the, especially if you're thinking about like a house, this is the frame of the house. And so you are basically just trying to start putting everything together, and you're starting to kind of see the plan of what the essay is going to be. So you know the essay will need to have an introduction, it should have multiple body paragraphs, and it should have a conclusion. Now, how many body paragraphs you end up having will greatly depend on the length requirement for that essay. So a 5-paragraph essay should probably get you somewhere around 2 to 3 pages fairly easily. If it's longer, then if your essay requirement is going to be, if the length requirement is longer than 3 pages, you're definitely going to need to have more than 3 body paragraphs. And so the essay should definitely expand and contract depending on the requirements of the assignment that you're working on. In the outlining stage, I do suggest writing at least a couple of your sentences. Write out your thesis statement. Write out topic sentences for each of your body paragraphs. Doing this will kind of create a plan, or a map, so to speak, of where the direction that you hope your essay is going to go. And I would also suggest starting to place your evidence. So hopefully in the pre-writing stage, you've done your research and you've selected suitable evidence for your essay, or suitable examples for your essay. And now you start moving that into position. If you're going to be using direct quotes, I suggest taking the quotes themselves, putting them into the outline, and I would also suggest go ahead and do citations at this stage too. So that way you can hopefully just get it out of the way. So the outline is where you plan out your essay. You plan kind of a roadmap of where you think your essay is going to go and what you want to accomplish. For the most part, most of the outline is not going to be written in complete sentences. The only sentences I would suggest at this stage kind of writing out as complete sentences are your thesis and your topic sentences. Everything else can just be general ideas, notes. This is just for you. This is for nobody else. This is just for you to plan out your essay. And outlining is a fantastic way of kind of getting yourself started, and it's a good way of kind of continuing to move forward. As I tell most of my students, and as I kind of hinted at when I was talking about jumping around from different processes, one of the ways that you can avoid writer's block is by just moving forward. Nothing has to be perfect, especially in these early stages of the writing process. As long as you continue moving, as long as you continue working on something. So for example, if you're working on your introduction, introductions are really hard to write if you don't know where you're going. And so work on the body paragraphs first. If you're struggling with one of the body paragraphs, move on to the next body paragraph. And then just keep moving, and that will help prevent you from having or experiencing writer's block during the writing process. And in the outline, just get the ideas down onto the page and have a plan. That's what the outlining stage is for you to plan out where you hope the essay is going to go. Next, we have the drafting process. So as I mentioned, if outlining is like the frame of the house, then the drafting process is where you start filling things in. You start filling in insulation, you start putting up walls, you start putting in the windows, you start kind of filling out the essay. So basically adding in the meat of the essay. If you have your evidence already in place, this is where you're going to add the explanations of that evidence. Why is it there? Why did you decide to use it for that particular paragraph, or for that to support that particular idea? And so the drafting is where you write out the complete sentences of the essay. You start including everything that you're planning to do. This is where the essay is really starting to take shape. This is where you can really see it becoming the house that it was meant to be. But once again, try not to worry too much about perfection. Write that awkward sentence. Write that sentence that doesn't quite make sense. Use the word that you think best works, even if you think that might not be the word that you're going to use in the end. This is still part of that messy process that I was talking about. When you're drafting, don't try to proofread and edit too much. I know it's tempting. I have that problem myself, but try not to get lost in the editing and revising or proofreading of specific sentences while you're in the drafting process. Just get the words down on the page. Even if your entire essay is basically just like one really long sentence, get it onto the page, and then you can go back and edit it later. The point at this stage is to just get words onto the page and to start filling out the rest of the essay. In the final stages of the writing process, a lot of students get these 3 different processes or steps confused, or they kind of intermingle them. They think they're all about the same thing, and that's revising, editing, and proofreading. And I can see why students kind of jam all 3 of those together, but they are really distinct, unique steps, and you should definitely try to treat them that way. Let's start with revising. Revising is where you focus on big picture issues. So this is not the stage where you're worried about word choice, you're worried about comma placement or formatting. Revising is where you focus on big picture stuff. So first, I would suggest looking at your thesis. Make sure that your thesis addresses the expectations of the assignment. Is it actually addressing or answering the question that was asked? Or is it fulfilling the goals or the expectations that your professor has? Next, look at body paragraphs. Are they well developed? Do they have a good structure? Are they actually supporting the thesis? Do you maybe need to change the thesis in order to kind of fit the rest of the essay that you've actually written? Do you need to expand? A lot of students, when I find that they are not meeting the length requirements of the essay, one of the first things I tell them is go back to your body paragraphs. Make sure that you are thoroughly explaining how the evidence supports your idea. Most of the time, students think that their evidence that they've selected is self-evident, that it does all the work for them, that they don't have to do any kind of explanation. And so I have to remind students that not every reader or every person they encounter is going to interpret evidence in exactly the same way that they do. And so they have to really explain each step in their logical reasoning. And so you have to really develop that out. And oftentimes students skip this part because it is hard. It is the hardest part probably of writing an essay. It's easy to find evidence and put it into places. It's easy to I would say it's probably even easy to kind of easier to create a thesis statement. The hard part is the analysis part. So if your essay is running a little bit short, go back to your body paragraphs, look at each piece of evidence, and make sure that you are thoroughly explaining how that evidence supports the topic sentence for that paragraph, and also look to see if your paragraph is explaining how the paragraph's idea supports the thesis. Everything should be connected. And so if you're running a little short on your essays, that's definitely the place to look. When revising, you also should look to make sure that your body paragraphs follow a coherent, logical order. So the kind of question that I usually give to my students, or I think about myself when I'm thinking about where to place ideas or how to organize ideas in my essays, is the following question. What does my reader need to know first in order to accept my idea, or to accept my idea as valid, or to accept my argument? What do they need to know first? And that's what I put in my first body paragraph. And then what do they need to know next? Then I put that in the next body paragraph. What do they need to know next? And then move on to the next. And so oftentimes I will use that as a kind of guide. Now there are other ways in which you can organize ideas. For example, you can organize them chronologically. You can also organize them by the strength of the ideas. So you can put your strongest idea first, or maybe you can put your strongest idea last. It kind of just depends on where you think it would work best. When it comes to the organization of ideas, I would suggest contacting or talking with your professor to see how they organize information. This is where you should definitely pay attention in your classes, and no matter if they're online or if they're in person, look at how your professor organizes information. That is probably how they're going to prefer that information to be organized when they're reading your essay. So pay attention to how they organize information and ideas, and use that to your advantage whenever you're trying to revise your essays. Next is editing. So editing focuses on sentence level issues. Where revising focused on the big picture of the entire essay, editing is where you're finally starting to worry about things like word choices, grammar, syntax, making sure that each sentence itself on its own makes sense to the reader and is contributing to the overall picture of the essay that you have created, or to the goal of the essay. And so 2 questions I would suggest to think about as you're editing your essay. Does each sentence in the essay make sense? Is it clearly expressing its idea? You should be able to take each sentence out of the essay and it would make sense on its own without the other sentences around it. Now, will it give a full picture of the essay? No, but the sentence's central idea should be expressed in that one sentence, and it should be expressed clearly. And so you should think about, does that sentence actually do that? The other question you should definitely ask yourself in the editing process is, does each sentence make grammatical sense? For this, I would usually suggest reading sentences out loud, and preferably reading them to somebody else. Like, don't have them read the sentence, say the sentence out loud, and then have someone else ask, like, clarifying questions. And if they do have clarifying questions, that means you need to go back and rework that sentence because it's not clearly expressing that idea. So reading aloud can be a very useful tool to determine whether or not the sentence is going to make sense. Since this is your writing, you should be able to read your sentence clearly, and it should make sense to you. If you can't read the sentence clearly, if you're tripping up over your words, or if you kind of have to stop and think for a second, then there's definitely an issue with that sentence, and you should revise the sentence and rework it so that way it expresses its idea much more clearly. In the editing stage, sometimes I will have some students who are very interested in writing style, and so they'll write these really long, complex sentences with really big words. And while that's fine, it's great, I would suggest, especially if you're writing essays to a general audience or to an academic audience, go for simplicity. Always go for simplicity. Sacrifice style for clarity whenever possible. Long sentences can be fascinating, they can be interesting. One of my favorite writers is Virginia Woolf, and she loves long sentences, and I love her writing. And so if you're writing to a general audience, they're probably not looking for style, they're looking for information, they're looking for the ideas. So yes, style is important, but it should not be sacrificing clarity or the expression of our ideas. So whenever possible, maybe pull yourself back and express the idea as simply as you possibly can. And finally, we've got proofreading. Proofreading is where you're going to be focusing on the tiny stuff, the minutia, to use a big word on that one. This is where you're going to be focusing on spelling errors, making sure that you're using the correct word. So for example, maybe you spelled a word correctly, but it's not the right word for what you meant. It's maybe like a homophone where it's two words that sound the same, but they have completely different meanings. This is where you're going to be looking for punctuation marks. This is also where you're going to be looking at formatting. If you notice, I haven't really mentioned formatting before. So formatting is like MLA, APA, Chicago. Formatting is something you should worry about last. Formatting is where you're focusing on line spacing, where you're focusing on margins, making sure that you're using the correct font and the correct size. Make sure that your entire essay is using the same font color. I do notice that when students do take material from online sources and copy them into their essays, that sometimes the font is a gray as opposed to a black, and oftentimes that's something that students will often miss. Same thing with font size. So they'll kind of copy and paste it from an online source, and the font will be different throughout their essay. And so those are little things that a lot of students will miss because they're not used to reading those materials. And so those fonts kind of look somewhat the same, but it stands out a lot to your professors who are used to reading this material. So for example, if I'm used to reading in Times New Roman size 12, I can immediately tell when a font shifts to a different font, like Calibri, for instance. So that makes a huge difference. And those tiny little things, although they can be annoying, they can be frustrating, they do contribute to the presentation of your essay. And the easier you can make the reading process for your reader or your professor, the higher your grade is probably going to be. So proofreading is a fantastic final step. But I do also want to say this: it is not the meat of your essay. I am more concerned, at least when I'm reading my students' essays, with the content of their essay, its structure, with its development. Not really all that concerned with the proofreading part of it, the formatting, the grammar, the punctuation. Yeah, all of those things are important, as I said, and they do contribute to the overall presentation of your essay. But a lot of essays that students are writing are written under duress, they're written under time crunches, they are not going to be the best work. And so what I'm looking for is I'm making sure that the structure and the development of the ideas are there. And the formatting, the punctuation, the grammar, essentially the small stuff, all of that stuff really doesn't take that much of my interest or even a strong portion of the grade whenever I'm grading essays. Now, of course, this is different with different professors. That's just me and my perspective. In the rubrics that I use for grading essays, formatting and punctuation may account for maybe about 20 points out of 100. The rest of the grade comes from the content and structure of the essay. Of course, there could be other professors out there who think differently and where presentation is the whole point of it. So for example, if you go into like technical and business writing, presentation probably is going to matter a lot more than it will in a composition or a literature course. And so it should not be the major thing that a lot of students are worried about. And that worry is, I think, what's driving a lot of students to using generative AI programs to write their essays for them, because they are so worried about the presentation of their essay that they're not really focusing in on the content, which is why a lot of students get frustrated when instructors catch them using AI, because the content is not there. The generative AI programs that are available right now oftentimes are mimicking, or they give very surface level kind of analysis or writing, at least the ones that students are using. And so the content and structure is not there, it's not well developed enough. And so that's why it can be a frustrating experience, because students think, oh, my essay looks beautiful, it looks pretty, it's got perfect sentences and perfect punctuation. But then they get a bad grade anyway because the content is there. So proofreading is important. It's an important part of the process, and it is good to go ahead and develop those skills, so that way, someone won't just be kind of making snap judgments on you based off of a misplaced comma or a misused word. That is still a good thing to kind of try and develop. But at least in the classes that I teach and a lot of my colleagues teach, we're primarily focusing on content and structure. So focus more on that, or at least spend more time on that section of the writing process rather than the proofreading stuff. I think a lot of students also focus a lot more on the proofreading stuff because that seems easy, and it is. It is easier. It is easier to catch errors and immediately correct them than it is to correct the analysis or to recognize a logical fallacy in your logical reasoning. It's a lot easier to catch formatting errors than it is to assess the credibility of evidence. It's a lot easier to do that kind of stuff. So focusing on the bigger stuff, the big picture stuff, is definitely a lot more important and a lot more worth your time. You'll get a lot more out of it than maybe working on the proofreading stuff. Though do spend a few minutes or a little bit of time focusing on proofreading. That always helps a little bit. And so the writing process is a messy part of the whole experience of writing, but it is a necessary, messy part of the writing experience. If you want to be a better writer, then you have to be more comfortable existing within that messy space in order to produce good quality writing in the future. And so I hope students are or become more comfortable with the writing process and don't try to shortcut that process. Because it takes time and it takes effort, and that can be frustrating for a lot of students who just kind of want to get the grade. But that process is part of learning a new skill or learning any kind of skill. Before you can actually get good at something, as I've said before, you have to be terrible at it for a little while. You have to be bad at it and be comfortable with being bad at it. If I picked up a paintbrush today and started painting a picture, it will not be a very beautiful picture. It will not be very skilled in its execution. But even the practice of painting will improve me for the next time. So the next time I decide to draw that picture or try to create a picture, I will get better at it because I've learned from my previous experience. So learn to be comfortable with the messiness of the learning experience, the messiness of the writing process, and you will improve your writing skills. Thank you for watching, and I wish you a good day and good writing.